Hi everyone, if you like what I do, then be sure to hit that subscribe button and consider checking out my Patreon. Enjoy the video. With the infection of the blood moon spreading into the oceans of Terraria, a whole host of bizarre and terrifying creatures came forth from the depths to terrorize those believing the waters would protect them. Beyond these mutant strains though, something altogether more ancient was awoken from its slumber. A race of creatures boasting a history beyond that of man or lizard, ones who cultivated a gleaming civilization before the spark of sapience awoke in their land-dwelling brethren. Those who battled against the great star god when he first stepped foot upon Terraria, but like all others who stood against the Great One, they would be cast aside, their achievements forgotten, lost to the depths of an unforgiving sea. When the world was new and the calamitous events that would befall Terraria remained in the far future, the fledgling species of Lihzahrds scurried about the land, only now beginning to learn the ways of fire and stone. Deep in the primordial waters of Terraria's oceans, however, a distant relative of these landlocked reptiles had already taken an evolutionary leap that would advance them far beyond any species that would emerge for millennia to come. Unlike the Lihzahrds who would come to scar the world and wage wars that changed the very course of history, these distant cousins remain secluded, quietly working in tandem with the natural world, remaining not but a myth for the entirety of their existence. They were the Merfolk, peaceful, aquatic beings who learnt the ways of kelp farming and squid herding to sustain themselves. Lacking the ability to create fire, as every other evolved species had, they went on to devise innovative ways of lighting and food preparation. Like they had around rivers on the surface, communities built up around thermal vents as Merfolk sought sources of heat, soon finding that the vents were ideal for cooking food they had hunted. As the population grew, makeshift structures were constructed around the vents as protection from predators and ocean currents, coming to be adorned with luminescent jellyfish, captured in jars as a source of light, a technique that had been pioneered by hunters traversing the dark stretches between vent fields. From here the society would only grow as any civilization did, with kelp fields stretching across the shallows, and ever more large and elaborate structures growing around the thermal vents. It was only a matter of time though, before the vent fields could not hold all of the Merfolk, and towns began spilling into the cold, dark waters surrounding them. Those who lived here stood little chance of survival, vulnerable to fierce creatures, or simply the freezing water of the depths. Drastic action would need to be undertaken, lest the Merfolk's development stagnate, and their legacy fade into obscurity. Luckily for those dwelling on the outskirts, there were those who recognized the issue, and had the vision to do something about it. The idea was ambitious, however, and their still relatively primitive civilization would need to undergo a technological revolution that would either catapult them into a golden age, or cause it to crumble to dust. These visionaries, or to some madmen, meant to crack the seabed beneath their feet, opening up new thermal vents wherever they pleased. If it worked, entire towns had the potential to merge into grand cities, allowing for the distribution of people and sharing of ideas like never before. But if it were to fail, then they may yet be consumed by the flame they crave so desperately, and swallowed whole by the earth from whence they had come. Regardless of the risks and resistance from some, the Merfolk choose to move forward with the project, and thousands of bombfish were harvested for their explosive agent, so a device unlike anything the world had ever seen could be constructed. The Merfolk would dig a borehole in the dark waters outside one of their towns, and place the bomb inside before detonating it. The shockwave was felt throughout their domain, and for a time it looked as if the experiment had failed. But eventually the waters around the test site grew warmer, and it became apparent that the audacious plan had actually worked. The now inhabitable seafloor was quickly developed, and soon enough the technique was being carried out everywhere, gradually linking all of the Merfolk's territory into one single nation. As expected, Merfolk society blossomed, and with no external factors limiting their growth, the world around them all but tamed. Their advancement became all but unstoppable. They created technologies beyond even what the Lihzahrds would achieve, spread further underwater than humans would across the land, and would even come to negate the reliance upon the thermal vents altogether. They reached such a peak of development that no realm was out of their reach. But even with all these technological marvels, the Merfolk never even entertained the idea of moving onto the land. They had reached their peak, and were not about to endanger at all by expanding too far. Besides, the ocean was their home, and all the surface world offered was danger and turmoil. Even though they refused to become embroiled in the chaos of the surface, there were forces that exceeded even the Merfolk's prowess. Forces that looked upon Terraria's oceans as the perfect staging ground for their conquest of the land, and would not hesitate to wipe away any resistance they encountered there. The Merfolk civilization may have been what many would call a perfect society, advanced, tolerant, and peaceful, but through no fault of their own, it would fall like any other, for the Great Old One approached upon his cosmic chariot, and before his might, none would stand. Before they would witness his coming with their own eyes, the Merfolk felt the Great One's arrival, for on the surface his descent had been heralded with a great flash and the sky becoming as flame. Below the waves, there was only that great tremor that permeated through the waters, alerting each and every Merfolk that something had changed, and was very wrong. For a time their lives continued on, an unspoken dread living with all Merfolk. While they did not know what to expect, it was assumed that any catastrophe would come swiftly, so little did they expect the slow and insidious indoctrination that would sow the seeds of their people's destruction. Unlike many of his brethren, Cthulhu had no need to rain destruction upon those he wished to rule over, for his mere presence would be enough to turn the hearts and minds of those around him to his whim. And in the period since his coming, rather than manically scheme upon a throne of skulls, he would isolate himself upon the ocean floor and fall into a deep slumber, his dark influence extruding from his very being, influencing others to do the Great One's bidding. From then on, growing numbers of Merfolk from across their vast civilization began to experience horrifying visions. They saw torment without end, twisted, inconceivable spaces, and a dark lord that stood above it all. Many who saw these visions were driven to take their own lives, but many more began to revere the Great Lord, seeing him as the only one who could bring meaning to the things they saw. Solitary, disorganized sects began worshipping the Great One, and it was not long before they merged into a singular cult that became a religion to the Merfolk. To the detriment of all else, a growing portion of the community dedicated themselves to the cult, and innovation within the civilization came to a halt. Merciless in its slavish devotion to their star god, the cult members would hunt down those untouched by Cthulhu's visions and sacrifice them as unbelievers until there only remained the true chosen. Finally, all that had made their people great quickly fell away, leaving naught but the idolization of an alien god beyond all comprehension. Now that their ranks had swelled sufficiently, Cthulhu's Deep Ones were commanded to construct a new city to honor their mighty god, and upon its completion, he would awake and lead them to salvation. The city would be known as Terraria, the seat in which Cthulhu would take rule of the whole of Terraria. Unknown to the Deep Ones, however, not all unbelievers had been purged, with some remaining concealed in the decaying ruins of their old cities. Now that the cult was focused on their new directive, the survivors were afforded with the chance to fight back. There were far from enough of them to launch any kind of offensive, but what they did have was the collected knowledge of their people. Using what they could find among the ruins, the survivors devised a plan centered around a device created out of high technology, ocean mysticism, and the collected fear of those fallen in the purge. They had created the first Neptune's shell, something with which they could do what was otherwise unthinkable. They knew that there were primitives upon the surface, rudimentary civilizations that had come and gone without even knowing of their existence, but now they must make contact. Surely if the surface dwellers knew that they too would be threatened by the Great Old One, then they would assist the Merfolk, using the Neptune's shells to become kin, and join in a war for all things beneath the sea. Upon venturing to the surface, however, the Merfolk did not expect to find a shattered world, still reeling from the eons of long subjugation by another cosmic horror. The devastated population upon the land now offered little hope to the surviving Merfolk, but still they had to try, and eventually managed to recruit a fair contingent of those unwilling to allow the dark times to return. Using the shells created by the survivors, the small but determined army set out for Terraria, but in the time it had taken to raise a fighting force, the city neared completion, and the Great Old One stirred from his slumber. Valiantly, the Merfolk battled their brainwashed friends and family, even getting the upper hand at a point, but ultimately all would be for naught, as at last Cthulhu revealed himself to his followers. At the height of his power and enshrined amongst the loyal, he cast away his foes with a single thought. Those who were not instantly vaporized fled far away from both Terraria and their old civilization, so deep into the ocean that the cold and dark changed them, the pressure warping their features into something entirely different, merely scarred and forgotten creatures from the deep, still clutching the shells gifted to them from the survivors. Used as his personal servants throughout his rule, the Deep Ones would eventually meet their end when their master did. No longer required to serve, it might have been that they were destined to slowly decay within another ruined city. This is if it had not been for the infection of the Blood Moon spilling into the oceans, for as it mutated other sea-dwelling creatures, its touch awoke the Deep Ones from their eternal rest, imbuing their rotting forms with a bloodlust to rival that of any land-dwelling zombie. The only bastion of true Merfolk are those who reside in the remote lands of snow and ice, fiercely defending their territory from any who may encroach upon it. Their story, though, is an entirely different tale. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked what you saw, then please consider liking the video, subscribing and sharing it with your friends. If you want to support the channel even more, then head over to Patreon, become a channel member or buy some merch. Links are all down in the description. I hope you all have a great day and I'll see you next time.